This week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, we hear the call of the Netherdeep, and James takes us on a journey through the new adventure module from Critical Role, as well as Dael, Shawn, myself, and James tearing apart the new Unearthed Arcana. All that and more right now. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 D&D and tabletop RPG podcast in the world. It's true, we've just checked the readings, they've come out, best D&D podcast on the internet right now, and it's because I am here. My name is Ben Byrne, if I haven't said. I am here with Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, James Hake. James returning once again to the Eldritch Lorecast after a slight hiatus last week, but it's because you've been so busy. But I have to ask, what level do your campaigns typically sort of get to, and what level range do they sit within?
Right now, my current campaign has just leveled up to 12th level.
Okay.
I like my campaigns to get pretty stinking high. I like it when we go close to 20th level.
Okay.
Just because I love the sort of changes in genre and ability for things to get really big and start dealing with those huge extraplanar threats. And I have a particular fondness for making some of those most supernaturally high levels come kind of at the behest of supernatural beings. I like, mortal characters kind of capping out in the sort of tier 3 area, because that's kind of the limit of the human body. But once you get to your sort of Achilles, Heracles sort of fighters, it gets very cool narratively to start introducing divine patrons and things like that into the fiction of the game.
There is almost like a different, I don't want to say skill, but a different, like, you can't just DM the same way that you do at levels like 1 to 5 or 5 to 8 or whatever it happens to be, wherever you draw those hard and fast range bands.
I think I brought this up in like episode 3 or something like this.
Yeah.
How it becomes a totally different genre of game.
Yeah, absolutely. Dael Kingsmill, what about you? Where does your campaigns usually sit?
As a DM, I like to hit around 10, personally. But as a player, I don't think I've ever gotten above 5. And I'm sick of it.
That's fair. Yeah, I my group are also kind of sick of starting at 1 constantly, because I'm like, all right, level 1, let's go. It'll be great because you guys will all suck, and like you'll get down in the dirt, and like you'll have to struggle for to survive, and the monsters are scary and blah blah blah. And they're like, man, we're just sick of this. Like, can we start at level 5 or 3 or something?
Can I be able to do stuff?
Yeah, exactly. They've been at level 1 for 3 sessions. We just started a campaign recently, and that was not by design. It's just we haven't found a good, like, they haven't gone for a rest or anything yet to find a good stopping point to level up. Shawn Merwin, where do your campaigns usually reach, or where do you like to settle them around?
It really depends on what story we're telling. We may start a campaign at
Oh no, that's the right answer.
Oh no, well it's not, but if I'm running a campaign that starts at first level, it generally ends about 12 or 13. The players that I play with locally, I think the sweet spot for them is between maybe 6th and 12th is where they get the most fun out of the game. And then after 12th, as James said, it turns into a different game, and that's not necessarily the game that we want to be playing. So we'll shut it down around there.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever gone beyond, I think, maybe 11th, maybe 12th level, like organically through running a campaign. I actually feel like there's a whole, and this is almost like a quick admission, there's a whole skill set of mine missing because I haven't DM'd games above sort of 12th level on a consistent basis. So every time it gets higher than that, I'm just like, I don't know how to cope. I'm like, they're so powerful. Somebody help. But speaking of powerful things, today, I think, if you're listening to this on the 15th of March, is the release date for Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep, the new campaign book, which was partially authored by one James Hake. James, how are you feeling at the launch of this book? Because we've been talking about it for a little while now.
I'm I'm overjoyed to see it out in the world. I mean, I'm glowing. This book is very much my baby. It's the first book I ever lead designed. Before I started doing lead design here at Ghostfire, Call of the Netherdeep was in many ways for me really a trial by fire. That book and Darrington Press's Taldore campaign setting Reborn were kind of concurrent projects. And yes, hell of a trial by fire, kind of learning how to do a lead design job on the fly, gathering together a bunch of tremendous writers, Mackenzie Darmus, Sadie Lowry, Cassandra Kaw, and Latia Jaquiz. And to say nothing of magnificent minds like Matt Mercer and Chris Perkins, who are my co-leads on the project. I mean, it's collaboration is the best part of making books like this, being able to team up with other people. I mean, it's just like in this podcast, we get so many cool ideas bouncing around, and that's the joy of it. So having that sort of position of being an overseer and working together to make all of the ideas connect and create a cohesive whole out of the work of many different, very creative people, it's just ideal. It's just magnificent.
What is the, like, for folks that are either interested in getting into, whether it's the gaming industry or some other, like, writing industry, or folks that are just kind of curious to know, because I think there might be some assumptions or misconceptions, maybe, I don't know, but what is, like, the role of a lead on one of these books? Because it's not like, you know, you work with a team, like you said, you don't necessarily touch every single word yourself, to my potential misconception, but as sort of, you know, drawing your team together and directing the sort of flow of the overall project. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I mean, let me give you some insight into this kind of from the other direction. My first D&D project with Wizards was on Waterdeep Dragon Heist, and I was not a project lead for that. I was just a freelance writer who Chris Perkins had pulled in along with wonderful writer James Introcaso as well. And, you know, it was very much like Wizards of the Coast rolls up to me in my Twitter DMs, literally, saying, hey, we have a project we'd like you to work on. Here's a vague timeline. Here's the rate we'll pay you. Here's a very vague brief. Are you interested? And I said, hell yeah. And so from there, the project lead gathers together all of the different freelancers and divvies up the work. There's a really clear outline of the book already in place. And the freelancers and all of the ones that are brought in to work on the project are set loose to be creative within the boundaries of creativity that the outline has established for us. Right? You know, if the adventure brief says you're writing an adventure set in Waterdeep, then you'd best not be wandering out into Thay or into Neverwinter along it all, unless you've got a really damn good reason to do so and the project lead clears it. So, you know, from there, as a freelancer, I kind of went off and decided to, you know, choose these chapters to write about, and I filled out a lot of different sort of almost flowchart-like paths that the adventure could take, sort of encounter by encounter, scene by scene, into my own sort of deeper outline. It gets approved by the project lead. Basically, every single step of the way, as you work as a freelancer, is kind of creating proposals, getting approved, and then going deeper and deeper, step by step, from outline to rough draft to final draft. And ideally, if you're working with a good lead, you'll be having regular meetings to kind of go over what you've done, check in, get some praise to bolster your spirits, get some criticism to drag them back down, and keep everything in balance so that you can keep on working and stay motivated to hit the deadline that's looming in front of you.
Sure.
And so thus, as a project lead, on the other side of that, I got to be the person who sets those deadlines, who has all the meetings with the freelancers, who creates the overall story outline of the story that we're trying to tell. And this is all very much what I'm doing with the Fables project right now as well. Create a big overarching structure, bringing in a bunch of talented different writers saying, hey, we would like you to create a story within these parameters, and then letting them run off, be free, and then corralling them all back in and making sure everything they've written is cohesive and agrees.
Sure.
Yeah. Shawn, did I miss anything in all that? You're doing very much the same sort of senior design work on the other side of the company. Are there any other aspects to it that you think are really, really important?
You miss nothing at all except for everything that could go wrong and does.
Well, everything that could go wrong is important.
Right. So at what James said is absolutely true, and in the best of all possible worlds, that is exactly what happens. Now, as the lead designer, you have a lot of work to do, and you can choose to do a lot of work at the beginning of the project to limit the scope as much as you possibly can so that the writers know exactly what it is that you want them to do. If you do the work there, you are limiting a bit their ability to use their imaginations outside of the scope of what you've already conceived, which can sometimes be good and can sometimes not pay dividends that it could have. But because if you don't limit that up front, then you have to do a lot more work on the back end, because you don't want to send to the editor a manuscript that is all over the place. So then you would have to do a lot more work then. So it's a trade-off. A lot of it depends on the type of project. A lot of it depends on the experience and the talents of the designers and the writers who you intend to employ in the design of your book. So it's definitely it's a very complicated thing with a lot of drawbacks and positives that you need to work out sometimes as you're going. It's definitely a high wire without a net act at times.
Gotcha.
In the context of Call of the Netherdeep, this is a very sort of broad, expansive, tonally diverse, globe-trotting adventure. And so it was fairly easy in certain ways to give the different authors kind of the bones underlying the overarching plot, and then say, but here's this area, and really focus on the tone of this area and this segment of the story. And then they went off and did that. And I was able to kind of corral all the drafts in at the end. And yes, there was a little bit of work on the end. I've kind of taken to the understanding that as a project lead, I'm still a writer, but the vast majority of my writing happens after the preliminary writing is already done. And there's just connective tissue and sort of underlying foreshadowing and subtlety that my part of the work gets to engage in to make sure that Chapter 2 appropriately sets up Chapter 3. And so on and so forth. And that, you can see the seeds of the final chapter in the foreshadowing of the beginning one and stuff like that. So it all feels like one story and not just a collection of episodes.
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting experience I'm having at the moment working on the Ghostfire Gaming blog, because a lot of the blog posts are surrounding or centered on Grimhollow, and just trying to make sure that all the blog posts, tonally match, as well as don't necessarily contradict each other in the lore of Grimhollow and the way that functions. Doesn't contradict any of the work that Shawn or Joey, you have done on Fables or the Monster Grimoire. And the thing that I slightly struggle with as someone who's very new at this and kind of a bit uncertain is like how much fiat do I have to kind of change what those writers, what those freelancers have contributed? Because I'm like, okay, well, this, I see what they were going for, and it's a creative, interesting idea, but it doesn't really fit. Should I send it back? Should I just change it myself? Kind of navigating those relationships is something that, as a person who's generally like, sorry to bother you, I hope it's okay, like, can I, do this? Learning to navigate those relationships has been interesting. Not to turn this into a therapy session for myself, but Shawn, I wanted to ask you.
How does it make you feel?
Is it different working on a book like the Monster Grimoire, which doesn't necessarily have like a narrative thrust to it, like Call of the Netherdeep does, or Fables, where it's this is a story that has a forward progression and everything has to kind of cause and effect fall onto the next thing. Is that challenging in a different way or less challenging when you're corralling writers to work on a monster book?
I worked on it in steps. So the first stage was to find 6 writers who I thought would do an amazing job if I just give them free reign. They understand the concept, the horror, but I'm not going to tell them what types of monsters to create. I'm not going to tell them what CRs to go for. I'm just going to let them do their thing. And then I get those in, put them into a spreadsheet and say, all right, we are very light on plant type creatures. So let me reach out to some different writers. These writers, I will give some more specific instructions. I need a plant creature in CR 4 to 6 range, maybe from this area of Etheris. Could you do that? And then you start honing things down and you start to fill in the gaps that would be there for a monster book, which doesn't take the type of coordination that a adventure path type product would take, where one thing has to link to the next perfectly. So, a monster book is a completely different monster, no pun intended, than an adventure, than any other type of role-playing game, book, or product that you're creating.
I wish that Shawn would be the monster director on a Pokemon game, because there's a lot of flying water types. Anyway, go on. Go ahead, James.
I was just going to say, and vice versa, if you look at the stat block appendices in Call of the Netherdeep, there's a lot of stat blocks in there. There's quite a lot of monster content in there, but a great many of them are humanoids or aberrations. Because of the themes of the story we set out to tell, we had absolutely no dedication to presenting a wide variety of new monster types. We were instead, dedicated to presenting a diversity of interesting story options, characters and creatures that suited the environments that we were telling stories about. A monster book's goal is to inspire DMs who have 1,000 different stories in their minds collectively. We set out here to tell just one.
Is there, speaking of monster stat blocks in Call of the Netherdeep, I know, James, you've been kind of posting, I think, some of the artwork on Twitter over the last couple of weeks of monsters that you're particularly excited for. And James, do you have some monsters that you've been really excited for? And I suppose, as a springboarding question, when monster stat blocks go in, I assume, and Shawn, you'd be able to talk to this a little bit more as well, I assume the stat block is basically what comes first, and then the artwork is based on the concept or if the monster's got a tail attack, okay, the artwork needs to have a tail attached to this monster. What's that experience been for you, James? And is there some monsters you're particularly excited for because of the artwork or the stat block?
We got there in the end. Yes, there are a number of them. And I think before I get into my favorites, I think I want to rope you in, Shawn, because there were a number of monsters in this book who had a concept which was then illustrated, and then a stat block was made after the illustration occurred, or at least it wasn't so. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. Often Steps 2 and 3 kind of had some interplay. Mackenzie Darmus and I were designing Netherdeep creatures kind of while sketches were coming back from the artists. Back in the sort of story Bible I created before any writing began, I had listed out there's 6 or 7 unique Netherdeep, aberrant deep sea corrupted creatures that show up in this adventure. And I had a paragraph or two of lore and sort of design consideration for each of them and a name. And I knew for a fact that all those creatures were going to appear in the adventure, and they were all pretty visually distinct. So I knew they were all going to get art. So we made art orders of them when that time came. But, when that time came was not the time that the monsters had been fully designed yet. Did you experience any of that in Monster Grimoire, Shawn?
We managed it up many different ways. In some cases, Suzanne had some art that she wanted to use, and she said, here's a bunch of great art that I have. Could you use those? And I said, let me see. Yes. So in that case, I would send off that art to the designer, who would design it based on the sketch that was already complete. There have been times when I've been creating monsters, not for the grimoire, where I was asked specifically, after you design the monster, you design the stat block and the text, the flavor text for it, also submit an art order that we will send to the artist. Then there are times when the art director is the one who wants to create the art order because they know exactly what they want to say to their artists. So then they will wait until the stat block is done to create the art order from that to send to the artist, because they are the expert on talking to artists and I am not. So there are many different ways that it can be done. And I don't know if any one way is better or worse, because sometimes great ideas come from seeing the art, and sometimes great art comes from seeing the monster that you have only put stats to. And so whatever process works for you out there, freelance designers everywhere, use that way. As long as it gets made, that's the important thing.
I love the idea that you need a specialist artist interpreter.
Right. It's funny, but it's very true.
I think the painter is trying to speak to me.
But
what are they saying?
This is some of the challenge that I've had, is like providing, particularly when you need to have a conversation that might be a bit uncomfortable because the artist or the writer hasn't gone in the direction you wanted them to. How do you have that conversation without sounding overly critical, and without kind of making them feel like they did something wrong, And I'm sure there's a skill to that for artists that might be slightly separate to writers, which is, again, exactly what I'm trying to navigate. I think that's totally fair as well, what you were saying, James and Shawn, in terms of like artwork inspiring the monster, because I know as someone who loves miniatures, I'll see a miniature and I'll be like, right, I've got to write rules for this thing because it's got it looks like it's got some sort of spines on its back, so you can't grab it or you can't tackle it or whatever it happens to be. Dael is someone who's been excited for Call of the Netherdeep, I'm assuming, based on what you said earlier about just waiting for the date to come up to go on to D&D Beyond and purchase it. What are you most excited for that is sitting in the book?
Well, I'm most excited for the adventure, which is not a very helpful answer because that means just the whole book. But what I want to ask, I've been lying in wait, because I want to ask James, who holds all the secrets, what do you think, if you could pick one thing from the book that you think each of us would be most excited to discover, what do you think it would be?
Very interesting. Okay, I'll start with you first, Dael. This story's villain, I think, will excite you tremendously. This character, I'm trying to be very light on spoilers, even though the book is technically out by the time we're talking about this. I think you will be delighted to delve kind of into the mythic past of Exandria and the sort of fables and myths that wind throughout the tale from the Calamity forward, and figure out how the sort of final boss of this adventure need not be a duel to the death, but could resolve in many different ways based on how you have kind of learned about the story up to this point. And I think you will love the encampment city of Bazzoxan and the demon-infested cathedral known as the Betrayer's Rise that this town has kind of formed itself around. Filled with soldiers and their families in an eternal struggle to keep the forces of the Abyss and the Betrayer gods from spilling out into the lands of the Krynn dynasty. It's definitely got your dark fantasy vibes.
Good.
Now, Shawn, I know that you have you've got a lot of different tastes. It's hard to nail down one thing exactly that you would love. How do you feel about factions and NPCs in your game, Shawn?
I highly approve of them.
I think, Shawn, you might get the most fun out of Oncarel and the Gazetteer section that appears in this book. Because right in the middle of the adventure, we kind of take a tangent and go and present like a full Gazetteer for a big, sprawling fantasy metropolis, along with a bunch of different, very flexible locations and adventure hooks. and factions with wants and goals and different story tracks that will all kind of guide you in the direction that the adventure is flowing by the end of it all.
That just felt like that part in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe where Santa shows up and Father Christmas gives out presents to all of them. That's what that felt like to me.
I'll be a jolly old D&D elf. I can do that.
I mean, that's basically, your job, right? Is just to be like, I will give this to you, and here's this this part of the adventure I've crafted for you.
Father Dungeon.
One thing that caught...
I'll steer clear of that one.
I feel like feel like somebody's got to like Photoshop James with like a big white beard and like a Santa Claus hat coming out of a crown or something. And he's got a big sword and a sack. One thing that did catch my eye, which I thought looked really cool, was the rivals, these NPC. Now, I'm basing this just on the clues and things that I've seen from the table of contents and some photos that were posted online more recently. But my understanding is that these are rival NPCs that have multiple stat blocks for the tier of the party so that they can recur and the party don't necessarily leave them behind. They can remain as an
Just like
ongoing
Pokemon
challenge.
again.
That's what I thought. It's like the party's Gary.
Smell you later. Yeah.
Smell you later.
I adore rival adventuring parties. I try and include one in some way, shape, or form in every campaign I run. I was actually inspired to do this by an adventure that Chris Perkins wrote in the 3rd edition era called The Shackled City, in which a rival adventuring party shows up with pretty low narrative stakes, kind of in the middle of the adventure. And it's like, this concept is so fun. What if we hung a major arm of the adventure off of this rival party? One of the big themes we want to explore and call the Netherdeep, because I'm a literature nerd, is what people will do for power, and how the hunt for power can corrupt people. And the party's interactions with their rivals is kind of a way of jabbing at player characters to make them consider what they're doing a little bit. Also, I love Dragon Age. I love potentially romanceable NPCs, and I know that my people in D&D liking are very much of the same mind.
Sure.
Just based solely on some of the reactions I've seen on the internet to these characters. Anyway.
Gotcha. Because they can be antagonistic, but obviously, from what you're saying, don't have to be. They can work alongside the party if the party choose to interact with them in that way. In the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition, there's I think, oft overlooked section on role-playing and social interactions and how the mechanics that 5th edition presents for those things arise. And there's actually 3 moods that an NPC can have. And you can hand-wave these. The people who play Critical Role hand-wave these. I hand-wave these in my game. But if you're trying to create adventure that simulates the depth of role-playing that Critical Role can have, and you are not yourself a trained professional actor, it can help to have these guidelines that kind of list NPC outlooks towards the characters as indifferent, friendly, or hostile. And it was really interesting to kind of dig into these sort of frequently overlooked mechanics of 5th edition and think about, okay, well, how can we use this to really show the really like take you by the hand and guide you into a heavily role-playing, character-focused scenario. And you also wanted to put the Dungeon Master through their paces, role-playing an entire other party alongside the player character's party.
Yeah, that's the real trick, isn't it? In Critical Role, there are often relationships with their NPCs, who are all very deep, detailed, interesting characters, that the entire party is like aware of these characters, but they really have a deep relationship with one party member in particular. To cite a very clear example off the top of my head, Essek Thalus's foil within the Mighty Nine in Campaign 2 is Caleb Widowgast. They have a very deep relationship. And while the rest of the party kind of knows about Essek and travels with Essek and has their own sort of small relationships with Essek, the DM gets to really pour all of their attention and focus and depth for Essek into the relationship between him and Caleb. And we give some advice in the introduction of Netherdeep that I hope gets that point across to DMs who are running it, is that you don't have to have your you don't have to have your rival party be really, friendly or hostile towards everyone else. In fact, I suspect that most of these sort of, if you have a interlocking web of relationships between every rival and every party member, most of them are going to be indifferent. But the ones that are really, really interesting, the ones where the narrative juice can be found, are the ones that are friendly or hostile.
Yeah. Yeah, I sense a Romeo and Juliet romance on the horizon in some folks' campaigns. Speaking of Critical Role, I know you don't want to give too much away. I'm just wondering, is Call of the Netherdeep, are there Easter eggs, are there references kind of buried in there for fans of the show to discover as they read or adventure through?
Yes. The Krynn Dynasty outpost of Bazzoxan is under the rule of one drow NPC named Varen Thalis, brother of fan favorite drow Essek. There are a number of other little Critical Role Easter eggs in there, but just on Twitter the other day, I saw a lot of people getting very, very excited to finally have some official art and story content for their other favorite drow hottie.
Right, yeah, for sure. Critical Role, Call of the Netherdeep, now on D&D Beyond, should be hitting game stores, I would imagine, very soon as well, if you want your physical copy. So go look for it, because it sounds like an incredible time. Speaking of campaign world settings, that's right, there's the segue for you. Another bit of news from last week, thank you. Just kind of like snuck out, I think, just after we recorded the Lorecast, from my memory, is the Unearthed Arcana rules, heroes, folk of Krynn, I think they called it off the top of my head, which is a race, a subclass, and some backgrounds and feats for the Dragonlance setting. Is anybody on the podcast big fans of Dragonlance? I'm personally not super familiar with it. Cool.
Well, now, hold on a second.
I'm probably the closest. And I can't say that I've ever run games set there. When the novels first came out, I read them because I was of that age where this is right in my wheelhouse. It's based on D&D, and it's cool, cool fiction. And after reading it, I was very excited about it. But then there were so many worlds in which to run your games, and if you wanted to create your own world on top of that, there was only so much time in the day, even for a teenager. So we just never, the group that I played with, we never got there in terms of playing in that setting. But the fiction was something that excited me about storytelling at that time. Here's
my hot take. I've read Dragon's Bottom Twilight and half of the other book, the second one. I know there's 3.
Half of the other one.
In fact, I know there's many Dragonlance books far beyond the original Chronicles trilogy. And enjoyed them so much that even having gotten busy and only having finished 1.5 of the first trilogy, I think, maybe a little naively, that Krynn should be the default world for Dungeons & Dragons. And
right, that's interesting. That is a hot take, and I don't know a lot about. I don't know a lot about Dragonlance, but I think I could get down on that hot take, because
Here's the reason this hot take sucks a little bit, and it's because Krynn breaks a lot of rules about kind of the core assumptions of D&D. Its setting without clerics is in an almost grim Halloweenian way, a bit antithetical to a lot of the baseline assumptions of D&D. And so that's why it will never happen. But I like Krynn as a setting a lot. It's very fun.
Why is that? Is it because I find, I can't remember if I have on the Lorecast before, but among my friendship group, I've definitely been a bit critical of Faerun, and it's just because it has to be everything to anyone because it is the main setting and kind of everything gets poured into it. But as a result, it feels to me a little bit flavorless because it's everything flavor. Whereas when you start stripping things away and pulling out, you know, certain classes or certain creatures or whatever it happens to be, that's when you start to reintroduce a sense of tone and place that is specific to the campaign world in which you're playing with. So what is it about Dragonlance, James, that attracts you as opposed to something like the Forgotten Realms?
Well, I think your question's kind of answered itself, and it's that there's a lot of very specific details to Krynn, in the way that the gods have kind of departed the world, and thus there's not a lot of clerical magic left. In the ways that there are a lot of very specific sort of enclaves of people, like the gully dwarves who live inside the great big dungeon. I think it's Zarzith Kittrell or something like that, that you go into in the very first book. And I think gully dwarves are a bit hit or miss from a modern reader's perspective. But I love the way that like there are very specific things in this world and niches that people can find themselves fitting into.
Sure.
And this is kind of antithetical to the very sort of broad open kitchen sink nature of fantasy that D&D kind of needs to have as its baseline setting, which, you know, it's a very hot take because the mechanics of it just don't filter out. But it would be very, very fun, I think, to just have more Dragonlance and see different corners of that world explored and get more sort of very interesting, specific stories being told rather than, like you said, that sort of flavorless, every flavor taste we've got going on.
Well, you may get that wish, considering they've done the Unearthed Arcana. There's whispers on the wind that perhaps Dragonlance... I don't know anything. I just saw your expression, James. I was like, I don't know anything. You'd know more than me. But, you know, who knows? Maybe the next book is a Dragonlance kind of setting or an adventure set in Dragonlance. When I was reading through the Unearthed Arcana, I don't have a special affinity for Dragonlance myself, although I know people that do. But what I found most interesting about it, the Krynn... the Kenda, the halfling-like race. I was like, okay, that's interesting. It's kind of like an alternative gnome. The subclass, I know there's been a lot of chat about, like, is it OP for a sorcerer, blah, blah, blah. What I found interesting was the backgrounds, which gave a feat, which I wasn't a fan of when I initially read it because the background feature isn't necessarily meant to give a mechanical combat advantage. But what I liked about the feats was that it was like an evolving, leveling feat that could tell the story of your character's evolution through leveling up your characters. You know, you level up your class, and then every couple of levels, your feat also levels up to evolve the story of your character, going from a squire to a knight or a acolyte to a fully fledged mage. Dael, I thought this might tickle you a little bit as well, get your attention.
Well, look, here's the thing, is that I think the backgrounds should give feats. I think that they should give feats. We've got this, like, distinction between features and feats, and every second background just gives you what is basically the same feature. I'm sick to death of a background just saying, you have food and lodging. I don't need food and lodging. It will never come up. I don't care. Give me something good. Give me something that compels me to choose this over the other backgrounds. You know what I mean? So I am of the school of thought that backgrounds should be doing a lot more heavy lifting than they do. I think that they should absolutely give you a feat that gives you something really cool. You know what's really funny though, is that reading, I mean, not just the backgrounds, everything from this Unearthed Arcana, I think the concepts were really strong and the mechanics were a little bit overcomplicated, which is such an ironic thing for me to be saying, because not only do I make the most, like, overcomplicated homebrew a lot of the time, but also I have specifically made homebrew that is for backgrounds that is really similar to things like the Squire. So, I mean, it's hypocritical, but looking at it in this document where everything was a little bit chaotic. No, not chaotic. There's got to be a better word for it. You know,
I know
tangled.
what you mean.
Everything's just a little bit tangled, which is rough because the concepts are so good. Yeah, I don't know. I felt the tangle. I felt it. It made me want to go back and simplify my own stuff.
Yeah, I agree with you. It was kind of like the Sorcerer of the Moon, full moon, new moon, half whatever, crescent moon, whatever it happens to be.
Is such a cool idea, the idea of the phases.
But then you've got to, I know in the Unearthed Arcana, they kind of explain it away, like on a long rest, you can change whichever phase you want to use rather than it being tied to the actual phases of the moon.
Wouldn't it be cool if
campaign.
It was tied to the actual phases, though?
I think it would be, but I think that's like a lot of that's extra work for the dungeon master to actually be like keeping phases of the moon and how many days have passed. And it also means that depending on how protracted or contracted your campaign timeline is, whether you have like downtime that hand waves a week or two away, or whether like every single day is an adventure day, it would mean that the phase doesn't change for like 20 sessions, you know, or longer if you're doing that really protracted day by day adventure day. Or you can never rely on what phase it's going to be at any given time if you're doing a more contracted version. Shawn, what did you think? Did you get a chance to look at it?
What if your world had no moons?
What if your world had no moons?
What if your world had 12 moons? Yeah, it's in terms of Krynn, it works because there are 3 moons. There is the sort of neutral moon, the good moon, and the dark moon. So it works perfectly for Krynn. And it works perfectly if your world is like our Earth. And I agree with everything that was said so far. I think it is... Sorcerer is a pretty basic class. You don't have a lot of weird mechanics that you need to get through. So adding a complicated subclass is good for certain players who want that sort of complication. But that's not something for me. And it does lead, especially at higher levels, to a lot of, it could be a very slow turn if you are using this sorcerer subclass and you use your bonus action to change the phase of the moon, which not only gives you an ability, but it also gives you something that happens right away. And then you could have 12 saving throws because you used this bonus action to change the phase of the moon. Oh, and that was just my bonus action. So now I'm going to take my actual action, which could be something that's equally complicated. So it's a playtest document for a reason. It is very difficult to create good mechanics that fit the theme of what you're trying to create and work for a majority of the players. So play test it out and see how it affects your table. What was problematic to me was actually the Kender, which if you are familiar with Dragonlance, Kenders in Dragonlance lore were creatures that were basically kleptomaniacs. They would steal without even thinking about it. And this led to people using that as the old, but it's what my character would do excuse. Because in the novels, it's hilarious. It's hilarious. And it's often very thematic that Tasselhoff Burfoot would always seem to have the right thing in his sack. Or it just so happened that when the evil wizard tries to cast a spell, Tasselhoff has his spell component pouch. Wow. So thematically it works in a work of fiction. You try to port that over into a role-playing game where you have millions of people doing it, you have a lot of people who are causing problems. So what they tried to do was fix that problem in this by saying, you have magical pockets that just random things appear in your pockets, which is cool and fun for people that love this sort of randomness, the Wand of Wonder crew, I call them, right? They want chaos to happen. They want these random things to happen. Even if it doesn't really help the player at the table with a problem. In other games, my friend Teos Abadia said this about it. In any other game where it's more narrative driven, it could just be like once per long rest, you can pull something useful from your pocket. Now, what that would do, though, is force the game master and the player to coordinate and come to an agreement about what that thing would be. No, it's not a Vorpal sword, but it is this. But D&D isn't always the best at modeling that into rules. And so that's why we need a table. And the table may or may not make sense or be actual helpful to the game or to the narrative in any way. So, it's a hard concept to capture in rules.
This is such an interesting topic, in particular because I've played, and I'm sure you've played too, Shawn, at tables where, the sort of wargaming mindset was very strong, and at tables where the sort of loosey-goosey narrativist mindset was very strong. And I say loosey-goosey with a great deal of love, of course. Because, I can imagine what you're describing here, you pull the right thing you need out from your pockets at the very right moment, feels perfectly in tune with, say, the Adventure Zone, where these are people who are getting together and telling a funky, wet and wild story with D&D as kind of its baseline underpinning. But they love to disregard what D&D has to say and pick and choose the rules they like to apply, which... in total fairness to D&D, is how the books bill themselves as being a loose set of rules that you can, apply consistently, but always serve to aid the fun of the table. But there are a lot of people who don't play D&D that way. There are a lot of people who play D&D in a very sort of, what did you buy in the town, and how can you use the abilities you have at your disposal to solve this sort of, problem that I devised but didn't really come up with a specific solution for. Use your ingenuity with what you have. And one of the challenges of D&D being a game in which, a game which tries to cater to all types, is that you can't just do that and expect everyone to like it.
Right.
Can I have another sidebar about the moon sorcerer?
Look, you've got to work on your segues, but yes.
Yeah, I'll go to the Ben Burns School of Segues. It'll be good. Okay.
Sidebar, Your Honor.
Speaking of phases of the moon, let's come back around to talking about
different kinds of players. The moon has different kinds of moons. So I would just like to say, all right, I want to take you on a journey with me of what my process was while reading this thing, all right?
Sure.
As a mythology nerd, right? So I'm coming through, lunar magic. This sounds great. Let me read on, okay? And the first thing you get, moonfire. Here you go, have the sacred flame spell.
Yeah.
This is such a pet peeve of mine within D&D products, is just that whenever you get to like a light domain or something to do with the sun or the moon, you just end up with fire powers. Because that's the only attachment that we can make between light and something for D&D. They're like, fire. Dreadful. But, so at this stage, Ben's doing his thoughtful disagreement arm cross. I see it. I see it.
Noticed.
You've done it before.
Yeah. I guess.
All right.
I guess.
Does it
Go ahead,
matter
Shawn.
that Sacred Flame doesn't do fire damage but does radiant?
I mean, that's a good point.
That's kind of what I was thinking, is like I always think of Sacred Flame almost as like ghostly flame, not necessarily like literal fire flame. And also,
but there's flame in the name.
Yes, flame in the name.
but that doesn't matter, right? Like the spell,
your thing about it being radiant doesn't matter to me, because I'm coming at this. I'm like, you're misunderstanding what a sun god is. You're misunderstanding what a god of light is, because again, I mean, I'm always harping on about this, but gods are not elemental. They're not like a god of fire. When we associate,
they can be.
I mean, sort of, right? But like when we say, Hephaestus, fire is a symbol of Hephaestus, it's not because he's a god of fire, literally fire. It's because he's a god of creation and the forge and inspiration and those sorts of things, right? It's all symbolic. So once we take something like a god of light and we say, Apollo, you can have sacred flame, it doesn't actually have anything to do with how gods function as a religious and societal structure.
Yeah, sure. I totally see where you're going with this, I guess.
Two things.
Go ahead.
First of all,
I love this.
I agree with you in terms of gods, but this isn't a god-facing thing. This is a sorcery thing, so it has more to do with magic than
true.
gods. And the second thing is, just to get really game mechanical here, the sorcerer has no cantrips that do radiant damage. So by taking this subclass, you are saying, here, sorcerer, if you want to be someone that can deal with undead better than regular sorcerers, this would be the subclass for you. So when I saw Sacred Flame, I thought, okay, they're making this sort of the radiant sorcerer as opposed to any other type of sorcerer that they have out there.
See, that's a good sell. That's a good sell. You're selling me on that.
This is a really interesting thing that delves into the sort of customizability of D&D,
Yes.
right? Because all D&D spells come with some flavor attached and then a big asterisk,
Yes.
akin to, in Tasha's guide, that says, yeah, but change anything you want about the spell. You use the mechanics and to reflavor it. Your magic missile shoots spectral chickens if it wants to, which I find delightful. But
More chicken damage.
by saying roll for chicken damage, but Shawn, you say this is a radiant subclass for sorcerers. I find that really interesting because if this were simply called the radiant sorcerer, if you had all of the exact same abilities but stripped all the flavor away from them and said, take this sort of package of stuff you can do and apply your own themes to it, I don't feel like that would be as easy of a sell for a lot of people. Some very mechanically focused people probably, but I think the Radiant Sorcerer wouldn't be quite as interesting, narratively speaking, as a Moon Sorcerer, even if you were just going to strip everything out of it instantly anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that with my thoughtful arm cross, what I was basically going to say, kind of similar, James, to what you just said, is like, Burning Hands is called Burning Hands, right? And sometimes I ask players to describe their spell. I'm like, all right, describe to me what this spell looks like when you cast it. And they're casting Burning Hands, and they're like, I take a deep breath in, my eyes flash bright orange, and then I breathe out like fire in an area. And then I'll ask another player in a different game, different time, and they'll read the text, and they'll be like, oh, I put my hands together, and it creates fire that kind of comes out from my fingertips. And neither's wrong, but particularly with spellcasting, one of my favorite spellcasting scenes from anything I've seen is the duel between Voldemort and Dumbledore, I think in like the 4th Harry Potter movie. And it's because Harry Potter kind of crafts spells or represents spells in similar ways to 5th edition D&D as being discrete things. This is a fireball, this is a Burning Hands. But in that duel, it looks like Voldemort is like crafting the spell. He summons fire into the palm of his hand, and then he like breathes on it, and it explodes into like, I think, a big fiery dragon or something like that. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But it doesn't look like they're just going like, fireball, my turn, thunderbolt, my turn, this. It looks like, they're almost weaving the spell in front of them. So bringing that back to the point, Sacred Flame doesn't at all have to be fire, right? It could be like light reflecting off the surface of the moon and coming down and hitting the individual, or the ground beneath them could swell up with light.
And that's what makes this game so great, right? Or this genre of games so great, is those gaps between the rules where you can fill in your own stuff and make it look how you want. That's wonderful. But my issue with Sacred Flame is twofold. The other thing is that we are talking about the moon, and even though, yes, you can fill in your narrative things to be like, yes, I'll make it about the moon, we as a society have associations with the moon that are as old as storytelling itself, and at a certain point you're trying to push against the current of that. And this is why, okay, so at this point in reading through, I'm like, oh no, okay, this is, I mean, you can kind of get away with it with sun stuff, but moon stuff is very, very different. The moon, it has very little to do with the moon's light. All right,
don't even get me started on star stuff. That's a whole different thing again.
The moon is about changeability, and it's about mysteriousness and secrets, and it's about it's got this whole connection with hunters and the hunted, which is such a contradictory dichotomy, right? But you see goddesses like Artemis, she is the goddess of hunted things, and she is the goddess of hunters. And so that's why it is so exciting, and I think could be simplified when you get to the idea of the lunar embodiment, and you've got full moon spells versus new moon spells. And look at them! Full moon, moonbeam, Death Ward, freedom of movement, like those sorts of things really tie in with that idea of the full moon phase, the idea of knowledge, the idea of hunting, the idea of, that side of things that we attach to the moon. Whereas the new moon phase, you do get that secrecy, that mystery, that sort of shadowiness that we associate with the moon as well. Because you've got, darkness, you've got mislead, things like that. And I can't help but think that there would be some other spell choices, like things like Pass Without Trace, that can kind of really consolidate those rather than and play into this idea of phases, just switch between the full moon or the new moon and really simplify. I understand that we're talking about Krynn and there's 3 moons and blah, 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 blah. But I just, it's just that for me, Dragonlance, blah, blah, blah. The thing is that for me, coming at it from the perspective of someone who doesn't have a depth of background knowledge about this setting, but does come at it from the point of view of someone who understands the role of these things in storytelling, it is jarring for me to be handed a tangled knot of sacred flame, the moon
Dael,
and light.
I have one thing to add to this, because we just went Dragonlance, blah, blah, blah. This is not a Dragonlance subclass. It may have been made with Krynn in mind, but if we look at Unearthed Arcana, there are mentions to other settings beyond Dragonlance, and indeed you can see in D&D's current sort of official approach, they are pushing a multiverse first setting, not even a Forgotten Realms first setting, to my great pleasure, but to a multiverse first setting. And there are many worlds in the multiverse that do not have 3 moons, that have 1 moon, or like Exandria have 2 moons, or something like that. And so all of these subclasses need to have a certain level of multiversal breadth to them. That means they cannot be so specific to the notions of moons for one specific setting like Krynn, which I think there are both pros and cons to.
What we're really talking about now
isn't it great when we disagree?
Think about no, it is, but I don't even think we disagree. But what it speaks to is the amount of pressure that's on these designers to make something works mechanically, works in terms of not just one world story, but every world story. And we already discussed how we want our worlds, or some of us want our worlds, to only work in that world. We don't want clerical magic in Dragonlance. So now we have to create something that will work in Dragonlance even though there aren't clerics there, or work in Dark Sun even though there aren't blank there.
I think,
and it's an impossible job to do all the things you need to do and to make everyone happy. It's a dangerous profession that we do here.
I don't envy him.
Putting ourselves on the line, exactly. Yeah. And I will be the first to complain about things.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be the first one to criticize something and then say, afterwards, and I really love the hell out of all of the people that work on this stuff because it's not easy to do.
Yeah. I think in a perfect world, you would release basically a new version of the player's handbook with every new setting you released, which is just an insane person amount of work to do, but would allow you to custom tailor all of your mechanical bits to the story bits that you're trying to tell. I mean, if you go and buy Dragon Age Inquisition, you're not going to also buy a player's handbook full of, generic Unreal Engine locked character class or stuff like that. No, the game designers had a game in mind, and they made the mechanical options to fit in with the story of the game they're trying to tell. You would not play a World of Warcraft class in Dragon Age Inquisition, even though there are many superficial similarities between the two. And by that same token, it's almost ridiculous to think that, you can take the same player's handbook classes without any tweaking or modification and throw them into one game set in the Forgotten Realms, one game set in Grim Hollow, and one game set in Krynn all at the same time. It's extremely silly. And yet that's what we do.
I don't know. I don't think I'm asking very much. All I want is for everyone writing on this to know everything about global, mythological moon history. Know everything. Come on. It's not that hard.
All right, I'll get to reading.
And the amazing thing is, I'm sure they do. Right? I'm sure they do know this, or at least somebody on the team does say, moon means a lot of different things. Right. And I'm sure they do. It's just they can't make it all fit into the text that they have to work with.
That's something that I'm learning at the moment with doing a bit of design work is like, all right, I've got an idea for this amazing like weapon or class ability that I want to implement into 5th edition D&D, and so it'll work like this. The example quickly being that we recently put the Monster Hunter class onto the Ghostfire Gaming blog, and I had the idea of one of the subclasses having like that weapon from Horizon Zero Dawn where you shoot like a rope into a monster and then shoot it at the ground and it like pins them to the ground. And I'm like, all right, so this will work when you have to be within this range, and then they will get hit and they can't move further away from you, but they could technically come closer, but you can pin them to the ground so they can kind of move. And at the end of the day, I was just like, this is not working at all. It grapples them. And then they can't move anywhere. And
I also want designers to do a backflip.
Yeah. It's just, you realize after a point, like, this thing that I want to implement is just not going to implement in the way that I want it to without creating so much extra text. And I think that's why a lot of the rest of the Sorcerer Moon subclass is so wordy and so, tangly, as you were saying before. Speaking of tangly things, this has been a tangly episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. We did run out of time to do any listener emails, which is totally fine. But if you do want to email us, the email address is podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. You can also leave a comment below if you're watching this on YouTube, and we do read through those and pick out some of those from time to time to have an argument about instead of Unearthed Arcana. And lastly, this week, I just wanted to say a very quick thank you and publicly acknowledge Rob, our editor on the Eldritch Lorecast. It's often a thankless job. And Robbie is moving on this week. We are bringing an in-house editor, Dante, but Rob has been responsible since episode 1 of the Eldritch Lorecast for developing the transitions that you see on YouTube, mastering the sound, putting us all in our neat little boxes and all that sort of stuff. So thank you so much, Rob. If you just want to throw like an image of yourself here, slowly fade to black and white while you're zooming in and play something like I Will Remember You, but preferably not copyrighted.
Eldritch Lorecast, I will always remember you.
Otherwise, if you want to catch up with us, you can see our Twitter handles just below our name. We will be back next week. Tell your friends about the Eldritch Lorecast. And until then, I've been Ben Byrne here with James Haig, Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, and we will see you all next week.
I will not forget you.